picture this. You're in the middle of a heated argument.
Right.
Maybe it's at a family dinner, maybe it's in a conference room, or, maybe it's just a relentless back and forth in the comment section of social media posts.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Exactly. You are debating a highly contentious issue, and after an hour of just exhausting back and forth, you finally do it. You present an undeniably true fact.
The silver bullet.
The silver bullet, right. A piece of evidence so solid, so incredibly well documented that you sit back and think, well, this is it. Checkmate.
But that's not what happens, is it?
No. Instead of conceding, the person across from you doesn't just reject the fact. They actually become more convinced that they are right. They dig their heels in deeper, their voice gets louder, and the gap between you just widens into this massive chasm. Why does this happen? Why do our most critical conversations so often feel like running headfirst into a brick wall?
That feeling of hitting a brick wall is a profoundly universal experience, and it is happening everywhere, every single day. We see it tearing at the fabric of our personal relationships, and we see it stalling our ability to solve shared problems on a systemic level. We've built incredible technologies for communication, yet our actual ability to communicate across divides seems to be, degrading rapidly.
Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today, we are taking a deep dive into a fascinating piece of source material. It's a book called How to Have Impossible Conversations, a very practical guide, written by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay. Now, on the surface, looking at that title, this might sound like a simple self-help manual.
Right, like a list of polite phrases.
Yeah, exactly. A list of polite phrases to use at Thanksgiving so you don't yell at your uncle. But the material goes so much deeper than that.
The core mission of this deep dive is to look past that surface-level advice and truly examine the systems-level analysis the authors provide. This isn't just a book about picking better words. It is a rigorous exploration of how the underlying incentives of our conversations shape the way we defend our beliefs, how they drive social polarization, and how they ultimately impact our baseline social trust. We are going to deconstruct the invisible architecture of an argument.
So what does this all mean? We have two massive, overarching questions to answer today. First, why do arguments about beliefs so often become impossible conversations?
Right.
And second, why do attempts to correct misinformation frequently make people more certain of their views? We are going to break down the mechanics of these interactions, and more importantly, we're going to look at how we can redesign the systems of our everyday conversations.
To start, we have to define what the source text actually means by an impossible conversation. We need clear parameters here.
Okay, lay them out.
The authors are not talking about a scenario where you are facing a literal physical threat or a situation where someone absolutely refuses to speak with you under any circumstances.
Right. If someone completely refuses to talk, there is no conversation to be had.
Exactly. No psychological technique can force engagement when the door is dead-bolted shut.
Those are the fringe cases. The impossible conversations we are talking about here, the ones you and I experience, are the ones that just feel entirely futile.
Yes.
They take place across a seemingly unbridgeable gulf of disagreement. We're talking about deeply held morals, politics, religion, fundamental worldviews. It's that sinking feeling of hopelessness when the natural give and take of a dialogue completely vanishes. The other person isn't speaking with you anymore.
They are speaking at you.
Back you.
Yeah.
Exactly. You stop being a human being to them and become a receptacle for their ideology, or worse, just an opponent that needs to be vanquished.
What's fascinating here is the realization that the more invested someone is in their beliefs, the more they usually want to speak about them. Getting them to talk is rarely the problem.
Right.
The difficulty lies entirely in the structural nature of the interaction. The authors provide a perfect and honestly painfully relatable example right at the beginning of the text to illustrate how poorly this usually goes.
Oh, the story.
Yes. It's a story they title, rather bluntly, Conversing with an Asshole.
I read that chapter and immediately cringed because I have absolutely been the person making all those mistakes.
Most of us have.
Walk us through what happened in that story.
It's a recount of an argument one of the authors, Peter, had nearly 2 decades ago with a colleague. We'll call her STL. She described herself as a liberal, and they were discussing affirmative action.
Okay.
As these things do, the conversation got heated almost immediately. STL argued that traditionally marginalized groups are coming from a deficit and therefore deserve better opportunities to level the playing field.
Makes sense as a starting point.
But Peter immediately pushed back. He demanded to know why that requires manufacturing outcomes.
I can already feel the tension rising. He's instantly taking an adversarial stance.
He treats it like a fencing match.
Yeah.
So SDL tells him he sounds like a broken record and that he doesn't understand because he hasn't personally faced those systemic struggles.
Right.
And Peter responds by saying, let's say you're right. I don't think you are, but let's say you are. What evidence do you have?
Oh, wow. So condescending.
Very. SDL honestly admits she doesn't have hard statistical evidence on hand. She just deeply believes it's the right thing to do based on her moral compass. And here is where Peter just goes for the intellectual kill.
The trap is sprung.
Exactly. He says, so you have no evidence. You have complete confidence and a belief for which you have no evidence.
Brutal.
He then hits her with rapid-fire, aggressive questions comparing Clarence Thomas to a liberal white male. SDL gets incredibly annoyed, tells him he's not listening to a word she's saying, calls him an asshole, and walks out. She says, we're done, and the relationship is essentially severed.
Wait, looking at that from a purely competitive debate standpoint, Peter might think he won, right?
He absolutely thought he won at the time.
Because he pointed out a logical flaw. He cornered her on a lack of empirical evidence, but the book uses this as the ultimate cautionary tale. Why?
Because Peter, looking back years later, completely admits he was being an asshole, and that SDL was entirely justified in walking out. If we break down the mechanics of his failure, we see a masterclass in what destroys dialogue.
Break it down for us.
Well, he interrupted her constantly. He used the word but to negate everything she shared. He shifted topics when it suited his argumentative flow. He ignored her underlying concerns entirely.
His singular focus was on winning the debate and intellectually embarrassing his colleague.
Precisely. He didn't win anything. He just ruined a conversation and closed the door to any productive future exchange.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because it's easy to look at Peter in that story and say, well, he was just being a jerk.
Right.
But the book argues this is a systems-level issue. We are all operating within an adversarial design when we talk about difficult subjects.
That is the core insight of the first section. This micro-interaction between Peter and SDL reflects the macro design of our ordinary argument culture.
Yeah.
In public arguments, especially online or in front of our peers or in a competitive workplace, the environment actively encourages adversarial reasoning. We are incentivized to perform, to defend our territory, and to dismantle the opponent's credibility.
Because when a dialogue is structurally designed as a contest to win, actual persuasion becomes mathematically impossible.
It does.
Because the stakes are way too high. If you change your mind in that kind of hostile environment, the social costs are incredibly steep. Think about it. If you concede a point in a Twitter thread, you lose face, you look weak.
You might even alienate your own social group who's watching you debate.
Exactly. Before we go deeper into the psychology of this, I want to make a very clear impartiality check for you, the listener.
Important context here.
Yes. Throughout this deep dive, we are going to be discussing politically charged examples drawn directly from the source material. We will cover examples spanning from left-wing to right-wing ideologies, touching on deeply sensitive topics. We are doing this strictly to illustrate human psychology and the systems of conversation. We are not endorsing any political side, and we are not taking a stance on the issues themselves. Our focus is entirely on the mechanics of how human beings argue about these issues.
That framing is crucial. To truly understand the system, we must look at the specific beliefs that trigger the strongest defensive responses. And exploring those triggers leads us directly to the most counterintuitive finding in the entire source text.
The paradox of facts.
The paradox of facts.
I struggle with this concept every time I encounter it. We all grew up, went to school, and were explicitly taught that the best way to resolve a disagreement is with cold, hard facts.
Right, the Enlightenment ideal.
Exactly. If someone is operating on bad information, you simply show them the correct evidence and they will adjust their worldview. But the source material emphatically states that this is fundamentally not how human beings operate. Facts fail.
They fail spectacularly in these contexts. It is a hard truth to swallow, particularly for individuals who pride themselves on being highly rational and educated.
Yeah.
The text explains that people generally do not form their beliefs based on a neutral assessment of evidence. They form their beliefs first, often based on social and emotional needs, and then they retroactively go looking for the evidence to support them.
So we act as our own PR firm, essentially.
That is a very apt way to put it. This is driven by two powerful cognitive forces. Confirmation bias, which is our tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already think,
Right.
and desirability bias, which is our tendency to seek out information that supports what we desperately want to be true.
We cherry pick. We decide where we want to build our house, and then we go scavenging for the specific bricks that justify building it there.
That's exactly it.
And the text provides some incredibly stark examples of this, particularly when a person's morality overrides their rationality. Walk us through the creationist and vaccine denier examples from the book.
Let's examine creationism first. The authors note that the empirical scientific evidence for evolution is absolutely overwhelming and uncontroversial within the global scientific community.
Right.
Yet, a massive percentage of the public rejects it entirely. The text points out that, with very few exceptions, this rejection is not because these individuals lack access to a library or haven't heard the basic arguments for evolution.
It's not an information deficit.
No, they reject the facts because of moral and social factors.
Because their environment demands it. They believe that if they accept creationism, they are being a good person in the eyes of their family and their creator.
Yes.
If everyone in their local community, their church, and their family holds this belief, their fundamental human need to fit in and belong to their tribe is vastly more important to their psychological survival than their need to seek out objective scientific truth.
Their moral and social minds completely override their rational minds. And the exact same dynamic is at play with the vaccine denier.
This is a really tough one for people to navigate.
Very tough.
But a parent who refuses vaccines for their child is not doing so out of malice or a desire to cause harm. As the text explains, they are primarily concerned with fulfilling the identity of a good parent. Their erroneous medical beliefs are tangled up in a complex network of other beliefs. Perhaps a worldview that dictates natural equates to good and artificial equates to dangerous. So their identity as a protector of their child is inextricably linked to that specific anti-vaccine belief. Think about the psychological weight of that.
It's massive.
What if they vaccinate their child and, by some extremely rare coincidence, something goes wrong? The guilt they would experience would be unbearable. So their stance isn't a purely medical calculation, it is a profound moral defense mechanism.
Now, consider what happens if you walk up to that parent or that creationist and you just aggressively slam a stack of peer-reviewed scientific papers on the table. What is the systemic result?
You trigger what psychologists call the backfire effect.
You do.
What exactly is happening in the brain during the backfire effect? Why doesn't the person just read the paper and say, oh, I was mistaken?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the neurobiology of the backfire effect is fascinating. The brain processes a threat to a core identity belief the exact same way it processes a physical threat to the body.
The amygdala activates.
Yes. When you present contradictory facts to someone whose belief is tied to their moral identity, you are not merely offering alternative data points. You are introducing a systemic threat.
Wow.
You are implicitly telling them you are a bad person, or you are a negligent parent, or you do not belong in your community.
So you are basically putting them into fight or flight mode using data.
Yes. You give them an urgent biological and psychological reason to defend their position. They will immediately seek out arguments to dismiss your facts.
Like questioning the funding of your study.
Or the bias of your source. And they will selectively retrieve facts of their own to bolster their position. By trying to talk them out of their belief using raw facts, you actually force them to rehearse their defenses.
Right.
The interaction leaves them far more entrenched and far more confident that they are right than they were before you spoke to them.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we take this psychological reality and apply it to the macro level, this explains so much about our current digital world.
It really does.
Think about the architecture of algorithm-driven social media environments. These platforms are structurally designed to maximize engagement, which they achieve by constantly bombarding users with contrary facts, outrage-inducing content, and opposing viewpoints presented in the most hostile way possible.
If a backfire effect is real, and decades of cognitive science suggest it is a powerful force, then social media is literally a machine that structurally reinforces extreme polarization. Every time a user sees an aggressively framed opposing fact on their feed, they do not pause and reconsider their worldview. The system triggers their threat response, and they dig their trenches deeper.
It's a terrifying systemic insight. The ecosystem rewards confrontation with visibility, and human psychology responds to confrontation by calcifying beliefs. Therefore, the very first non-negotiable rule the authors establish for having impossible conversations is borrowed from medicine. First, do no harm.
Introducing facts to change someone's mind usually talks them further into their original belief. It's the conversational equivalent of pouring gasoline on a fire. If you want to change a mind, you have to stop throwing facts at it.
But hold on, I have to push back here. That sounds incredibly frustrating, maybe even irresponsible.
How so?
If I know the other person's belief is demonstrably false or even harmful to society, why shouldn't my goal be to defeat that bad idea with the truth? Why do I have to stop throwing facts?
It feels deeply counterintuitive, I know.
Yeah.
But Boghossian and Lindsay argue that trying to win the debate through brute force facts actually guarantees the bad idea survives and strengthens.
Okay.
This is where we transition from understanding the cognitive problem to deploying beginner and intermediate tools to redesign the interaction. The core proposal is a fundamental shift in the incentive architecture of the conversation. You have to shift from a competitive debate to a cooperative inquiry.
So I really do have to stop trying to win.
If your actual goal is persuasion, yes. If your goal is just to feel superior, keep arguing. But if you want to decrease someone's cognitive rigidity, to lower their defensiveness, you must prioritize rapport above all else.
Rapport is the key.
When people feel heard, respected, and psychologically safe, the perceived threat level in their amygdala drops. The shields come down. Only then is cognitive flexibility, the willingness to entertain new ideas, even neurobiologically possible.
Okay, that makes sense on a systemic level, but how do we actually do that in real life? One of the most practical tools the authors offer for building this rapport is a concept they call building golden bridges.
Yes, a beautiful concept.
I want to spend some time on this because it's brilliant. The idea is that you must build a socially acceptable, dignified way for someone to avoid embarrassment if they're going to change their mind.
It is a profound metaphor derived from military strategy. Sun Tzu wrote that you should build a golden bridge for your retreating enemy. If someone is trapped on an island of bad ideas and you are relentlessly attacking them, they will fight to the death on that island because surrender means humiliation. You have to build them a beautiful golden bridge so they can walk across to a new perspective without losing their dignity or their sense of self-worth.
How does that look in practice? Let's go back to the vaccine discussion, which is notoriously difficult. Very few people will willingly admit they have a mistaken belief if public humiliation is the immediate consequence.
No one wants to be humiliated.
Right. For a parent, admitting vaccines are actually safe means admitting they were previously putting their child at risk by avoiding them. That is a massive, incredibly painful psychological hurdle. So you build a golden bridge.
How would you construct that bridge in a conversation?
Instead of saying you're reading pseudoscience, you say something like, you know, that initial study from years ago that linked vaccines to autism was genuinely terrifying. When it came out, it was everywhere in the news. I completely understand why you, as a parent who deeply cares about their child's health, would see that and decide to be cautious. It shows you are really looking out for your kids.
Notice the systemic shift in that phrasing. It validates their moral intent, being a good, protective parent, while simultaneously creating the necessary space to eventually revise the factual belief.
You remove the shame from the equation.
Exactly. You allow them the internal narrative of saying, yes, I was acting responsibly on the best information I had at the time, but now new information allows me to update my view without having to admit I was a bad person.
It's incredibly empathetic, but it's also highly strategic. It bypasses the threat response. Another fundamental tool the authors discuss is modeling, and they share a really intense, high-stakes story about Peter speaking with a Muslim community leader in Australia.
That is a very powerful example.
The topic was incredibly heavy. They were discussing the ideological position on whether women should be stoned to death for adultery. Peter repeatedly asked the spokesperson a very direct question about his stance, and he couldn't get a straight answer.
The leader kept deflecting.
Deflecting constantly, asking, why are you focusing on this? Why not men? Why shouldn't men be stoned? And launching into convoluted historical stories.
In a typical adversarial conversation, this is precisely the moment where the dialogue breaks down. One party gets frustrated, raises their voice, accuses the other of dodging the question, and the interaction devolves into mutual accusations of bad faith.
Right.
But Peter did something highly disciplined. He recognized that to get the specific conversational behavior he wanted, a direct answer, he had to model that behavior first.
He literally asked the community leader to ask him the question. The leader is confused and says, what do you mean? Peter says, would you please ask me right now if I believe women should be stoned to death for adultery?
The tension must have been incredible.
The leader pauses, confused by the shift in dynamics, but then asks him. Peter simply looks at him and says, no. Now, do you believe women should be stoned to death for adultery? There's a long, heavy pause, and the community leader finally says, yes.
What's fascinating here is the absolute psychological discipline it takes to execute that in a tense environment.
Yeah.
If you want a direct answer, you must model answering a direct question without evasion.
Yeah.
If you want civility, you must model unshakable civility. If you want your conversational partner to be open to changing their mind, you must actively demonstrate your own genuine willingness to change yours. It is a mirror effect. You set the rules of engagement not by demanding them, but by embodying them.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and we move from managing emotions to actually navigating the complexities of human knowledge. The authors introduce a psychological concept called the unread library effect.
This is a brilliant concept.
This blew my mind. We all walk around with this illusion that we understand complex issues much better than we actually do. It's like having a massive library full of dense books in your house because you own the books and you see the spines every day. You feel like you possess the knowledge inside them, even though you haven't read a single page.
The formal psychological term for this is the illusion of explanatory depth. It is a pervasive cognitive bias. The text highlights a fascinating 2013 study by cognitive scientist Philip Fernbach and his colleagues showing exactly how this applies to our political beliefs.
What do they test?
They used highly complex policies to test this, specifically things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which was a massive, incredibly dense international trade agreement.
During the 2016 election cycle, people across the entire political spectrum passionately hated the TPP. People were marching in the streets. They were ready to be single-issue voters over a trade deal. Yet, as the text points out, the actual legislation was so intricate, spanning thousands of pages of tariff schedules and regulatory frameworks, that realistically, only a handful of trade economists and lawyers in the world legitimately understood its mechanics.
So Fernbach's study asked participants to rate how strongly they supported or opposed these complex policies. As expected, people expressed extreme, highly polarized views. Then, the researchers asked the participants a simple question. Can you explain, in step-by-step detail, exactly how this policy would be implemented and what its specific mechanistic impacts would be?
And what happened? Because if you asked me to explain the mechanistic impacts of international tariff law, I would freeze.
That is exactly what happened to the participants. As they tried to explain the mechanics, they quickly realized they couldn't. They stumbled. They reached the edge of their actual knowledge almost immediately.
Wow.
The study measured their positions again afterward and found that their extreme political polarization dropped significantly. Their confidence shattered.
Because they realized their outrage was based on borrowed knowledge. They had heard a talking point from a cable news host or a thought leader they trusted, and they absorbed the emotional outrage without absorbing the actual mechanics of the policy. So how do we use this unread library effect in an impossible conversation?
You utilize it by asking for mechanistic explanations. Crucially, you do not call them stupid. You do not say, you don't know what you're talking about, because that triggers the backfire effect.
Right, that just brings the shields back up.
Exactly. Instead, from a posture of genuine curiosity, you ask them to explain the policy to you in granular detail. You ask, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. How exactly would the logistics of that work? What are the specific economic mechanisms that would cause the outcome you're describing?
And because you ask them in a collaborative, curious tone, they are doing the talking. You weren't attacking their identity. You were just asking for an explanation of a system. This naturally nudges them to expose their own ignorance to themselves. It naturally instills a profound sense of doubt without you ever having to deliver a lecture, raise your voice, or throw a single contradictory fact at them.
It's a remarkably subtle, almost invisible intervention. They lead themselves into intellectual humility. But this relies heavily on the quality of the questions you ask, which brings us to the next major shift in the conversational system, the Socratic shift.
Okay, let's unpack this Socratic shift. We are moving away from asserting our own claims and shifting entirely toward asking calibrated questions.
Yes.
The Socratic method is named after Socrates, obviously, who wasn't famous for standing on a box giving long lectures. He was famous for roaming around Athens asking targeted, slightly annoying questions. What is justice? What is courage? He focused the inquiry on the foundation of the belief.
The authors draw heavily on this philosophical tradition, but they also pull from modern tactical negotiation, specifically the work of former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss.
Oh, that's an interesting crossover.
Voss's methodology emphasizes the use of what he calls calibrated questions. These are open-ended questions that are carefully designed to invite the other person to talk at length and reveal their underlying thoughts, rather than just giving a reflexive one-word answer. They almost always start with how or what.
Give me an example of the difference between a normal question and a calibrated question.
If you ask a closed question like, does this look good to you? Or do you think this policy is fair? The brain can answer with a simple yes or no without doing any heavy lifting. It requires zero cognitive effort.
Right.
But if you calibrate the question and ask, how does this policy seem to you? Or what are the primary factors driving your view on this? It sounds like a minor semantic difference, but it completely changes the cognitive processing required to answer. It forces the respondent to pause, reflect, and articulate their internal reasoning.
And to further encourage that deep reflection, the authors introduce a tactic that I've actually started using, and it works remarkably well, using scales. Asking someone, on a scale from 1 to 10, how confident are you that this belief is true?
It's a fantastic tool.
This is described as a brilliant metacognitive tool. But I want to make sure we're clear on the terminology here. What exactly does metacognition mean in the context of an argument?
Metacognition, quite simply, is thinking about your own thinking. It is stepping outside of your immediate emotional reaction and observing your own thought process as if you were a third party.
Okay.
When we are arguing, our brains are usually locked in a binary defensive posture. I am completely right, and you are completely wrong. It is a zero-sum game. There is no nuance.
But when you ask for a number from 1 to 10, you force a system override.
Precisely. You force the brain to step outside the heat of the argument and evaluate the certainty of the belief itself. If you ask, how confident are you on a scale of 1 to 10, and they say they are an 8, your immediate follow-up is vital.
You don't argue with the 8.
You do not argue against the 8. You do not say, here's why you should be a 2. Instead, you ask, why didn't you say 10? Or what kind of new information would it take to move you from an 8 down to a 6?
That is so entirely different from a normal argument. You are exploring the boundaries of their belief rather than attacking the center of it. You're mapping their mental landscape. And that leads directly to the ultimate epistemological question, which is really the core of this entire methodology: disconfirmability.
Disconfirmability is a foundational concept in the philosophy of science. It dictates that for a belief to be grounded in reality, there must be some condition, some piece of hypothetical evidence under which it could be proven false.
Right.
If there are absolutely no conditions under which a belief could ever be false, then the person does not regard it as a hypothesis, they regard it as an absolute, immutable truth. And attempting to argue against an immutable truth using logic is a complete waste of everyone's time.
The authors use an incredible analogy in the text to explain this, which they call aliens hijacked the beer truck. It perfectly illustrates exactly why we usually ask the wrong questions when trying to figure out someone's reasoning.
It's a great visual.
Imagine you are driving down the highway with a friend, and there is a large box truck in front of you. Your friend points at it and says, "That truck is filled with beer." Now, the standard way we've been taught to have a rational conversation is to challenge their assertion by asking, "How do you know that?"
And we think asking how do you know that is a smart, critical question. But what happens systemically when you ask it? Your friend simply lists the confirming evidence.
Yeah.
They say, because it says beer on the side in giant letters, the driver's wearing a brewery uniform and it's headed toward the distribution center. You have just asked a question that allowed them to cement their belief.
Exactly. The text actually calls the question, "How do you know that?" a conversational heresy, because it actively backfires. It outlines their epistemology, how they arrived at the belief, but it does absolutely nothing to introduce doubt.
Nothing at all.
Even if you, playing devil's advocate, offer a counterexample and say, well, maybe aliens hijacked the truck and replaced all the beer with water, your friend will just scoff at you. They'll say, why should I believe that? There's no evidence of aliens. Both your initial question and your hypothetical counterexample just further entrenched them in their original certainty. You performed a reverse intervention on them.
This raises an important question. If how do you know that is the wrong question, what is the right question to ask? The most powerful question to introduce doubt is, how could that belief be wrong? Or under what specific conditions could your belief be false?
Because asking how could that be wrong forces their brain to actively look for disconfirming conditions. It switches their cognitive machinery from a defensive confirming posture to an exploratory hypothetical posture. They have to think, well, if the truck pulled over and unloaded a bunch of furniture, then I'd be wrong. But here is where we hit a massive, sometimes insurmountable speed bump in impossible conversations. What happens when you ask someone what would change their mind and they give you a wildly implausible disconfirmation condition?
This happens constantly in deeply ideological, political, or religious debates. The text gives a provocative hypothetical example involving the resurrection of Christ. You ask a devout believer what evidence would disconfirm their belief, and they reply, "I would only change my mind if you literally produced the bones of Christ in a bag and proved they were his."
Which is an impossible standard. Even if an archaeologist found ancient bones in the Middle East and had overwhelming scientific consensus and DNA evidence linking it to the historical figure, the believer would just pivot.
They would.
They would say, science isn't absolute, carbon dating is flawed, these could be anyone's bones. The authors point out that millions of people do this with the story of Noah's Ark, maintaining belief despite the sheer geological and biological impossibility of a global flood housing every species on a wooden boat. So I have to ask, why do people offer these impossible standards? Are they just being stubborn, or do they genuinely not understand how science works?
It is rarely a lack of understanding. The text is clear that these individuals often perfectly understand epistemology and the rigorous tools of science when it comes to evaluating other, non-ideological claims.
Like everyday things.
Exactly. If they were buying a car, they'd demand empirical evidence of its safety. But when they offer wildly implausible disconfirmation conditions for a core ideology, it proves that the belief is not actually operating on the level of facts and evidence at all. It is morally motivated. They know their belief isn't objectively disconfirmable, but they offer the impossible standard to appear fair, reasonable, and open-minded to themselves and to you.
The philosopher Daniel Dennett coined a brilliant term for this: belief in belief. It means they don't just hold the belief, they believe that they should hold the belief because holding it is what makes them a good person. Abandoning the belief wouldn't just mean admitting an intellectual error, it would mean becoming a worse person. So the impossible standard is an impenetrable psychological defense mechanism to protect their moral standing within their community.
This is a profound realization for anyone trying to navigate an impossible conversation. When someone demands the bones of Christ in a bag or absolute proof that a social policy will have zero negative side effects forever, the issue you must address is no longer the belief itself or even the data surrounding it.
Right.
The issue is their underlying conviction that they have a strict moral obligation to hold that position. And when you encounter someone operating entirely on this moral level, you have moved from an intermediate conversation to the master level. You're conversing with an ideologue.
Okay, let's unpack this term. Ideologue gets thrown around a lot as an insult. How does the book define an ideologue, and how do we identify one in the wild?
There are clear signs.
The text outlines very specific behavioral traits. You will see extreme sensitivity, hyper-defensiveness, and an overt sense of righteousness. They possess an absolute, categorical unwillingness to hear an opposing point of view, often accompanied by disproportionate anger and sharp, unfair accusations if you challenge them.
Yes.
The authors use a great metaphor. They say arguing with an ideologue is like playing pigeon chess. You try to play by the rules of logic, and the pigeon just knocks over the pieces, craps on the board, and struts around victorious.
And one of the most telling systemic signs of an ideologue's entrenchment is their immediate resort to weaponized moral language. If you express a substantive, nuanced disagreement about a complex policy, say border security or healthcare logistics, they do not respond with policy details.
They bypass the intellect entirely.
They bypass the intellect and respond by attacking your core character. As the text notes, they might say something like, "You just don't care about dead children," or "You want people to suffer."
At that point, a normal give-and-take conversation seems truly, literally impossible. They are evangelizing, not conversing. So what is the strategy here? If building a golden bridge fails and asking calibrated questions just gets you yelled at, how do you talk to someone who refuses to be reasonable?
This is where you must execute the most difficult, counterintuitive pivot in the entire methodology. You must stop talking about facts entirely. You have to completely abandon the discussion about the specific issue itself, whether it's immigration, vaccines, the TPP, or religion. You drop the subject.
Drop it entirely.
Entirely. Instead, you shift the conversation entirely to their moral epistemology.
Their moral epistemology. That sounds incredibly academic. I need a practical example. What does that actually mean when you're face-to-face with someone screaming at you?
Let's break it down. Epistemology is simply the study of knowledge, how we know what we know. Moral epistemology is how we know our values are the correct values.
Okay.
Let's use a non-political example first to ground this. Imagine someone claims that stealing a loaf of bread to feed a starving family is objectively, morally wrong under all circumstances. If you debate the economics of the bread, you get nowhere. Instead, you ask about their moral epistemology. How do you know that strict adherence to the law is more morally valuable than preserving a human life? What process did you use to arrive at that moral hierarchy?
You are questioning the foundation, not the house.
Exactly. The text points out that very few of us have ever deeply, rigorously pondered the process we use to come to moral knowledge. We usually rely on our guts, our cultural upbringing, or our religious community to tell us what is just and fair. We have intensely strong feelings about our moral conclusions, but incredibly brittle, fragile defenses for the actual process that got us there.
So, an ideologue might have incredibly rehearsed, bulletproof talking points defending their conclusion, like, this specific immigration policy is destroying the moral fabric of the country. But they have very flimsy, unexamined defenses for how they determined that this specific value system is the ultimate objective truth of the universe.
Precisely. The text advises treating your questions like a micro-razor. Your goal is to slowly, patiently, ask targeted identity-type questions that fray the tether between their specific belief and their overarching sense of identity.
That's fast.
You're trying to subtly sever the connection between holding this specific belief about immigration and being a good person. You want to induce doubt, not in the immigration statistics, but in the reliability of the process they use to form their absolute moral certainty.
Because that brittle moral epistemology is their chink in the armor. It is where they are most vulnerable to self-doubt. Now, if you can actually establish a microsystem of trust, if you can build enough rapport to have this deep, probing conversation without triggering an explosion, the authors offer a master-level technique for mutual exploration. Synthesis.
Yes, synthesis. And it's basically conversing like professional philosophers, but it sounds incredibly difficult to pull off.
Synthesis is a collaborative effort where both parties explicitly agree to help each other refine their positions. It requires immense psychological safety, which is why all the previous steps, building rapport, constructing golden bridges, active listening, are mandatory prerequisites. You cannot jump to synthesis with a stranger on Twitter.
The authors break synthesis down into 5 sequential steps. Step 1, present an idea clearly. Step 2, invite and genuinely listen to counterarguments. You explicitly ask your partner, what am I missing? Is my reasoning flawed here?
That's the hardest step.
Step 3, formulate disconfirmation conditions together. Step 4, use those instances of possible disconfirmation to refine your original position. You actively incorporate their valid counterarguments into a new, modified stance. And Step 5, repeat the cycle. It is essentially the scientific method applied to interpersonal dialogue. But note how intensely vulnerable Step 2 is. Asking someone, what am I missing? And truly meaning it requires you to genuinely separate your ego from your ideas. It requires profound intellectual humility.
Let's roleplay that for a second because it's so hard. If I believe a policy is vital for human rights and I ask you, what am I missing? My brain is screaming at me that giving you space to answer might legitimize a harmful viewpoint. The psychological taxation of sitting there and listening to a counterargument without interrupting is immense.
It is exhausting. As the text reminds us, you have to internalize the mantra that you are not your beliefs. If your belief is proven wrong or incomplete through synthesis, you are not destroyed as a person, your understanding is simply upgraded. But the fear of identity destruction makes Step 2 almost unbearable for many people.
Which is why synthesis is incredibly rare in our modern world. Most of us never reach Step 1 without yelling, let alone survive Step 5. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most vital part of our exploration today, the macrosystem implications.
The big picture.
Why does this microsystem of interpersonal dialogue, these techniques for talking to your uncle or a stranger on the internet, matter on a broad, systemic level?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to recognize that individual belief formation does not happen in a vacuum. It is deeply embedded in larger, pervasive systems. Our media ecosystem, our political narratives, our cultural incentives, they all shape how we process information and interact with one another. We currently live in a revolutionary digital and social media economy that financially incentivizes and mathematically rewards outrage, tribalism, and algorithmic certainty.
Our political narratives actively frame disagreement not as a natural difference of opinion in a complex world, but as a high-stakes moral conflict between absolute good and absolute evil. Our culture rewards public performance, dunking on opponents, and aggressively signaling our virtues far more than it rewards intellectual humility, nuance, or careful listening.
And in such hyper-combative environments, constructive dialogue becomes structurally rare. The authors of the source material are providing tools to counter those massive cultural dynamics by empowering us to redesign the microsystem of the conversations we actually control. The true crisis in perception here is that we are constantly misinterpreting the surface problem.
I think this is the core takeaway. The surface problem looks like two stubborn individuals who just can't agree on immigration or climate change or religion. It looks like a failure of interpersonal intellect. But the deeper structural issue, the invisible system at play, is that our modern communication environments explicitly reward confrontation. Because of the adversarial environment we are swimming in, people fundamentally misinterpret simple disagreement as outright hostility.
And critically, they misinterpret persuasion as defeat. When dialogue is structured as a public contest, human beings will protect their beliefs at all costs to preserve their status and identity. They will not examine their beliefs, they will armor them. But when we consciously choose to use the tools outlined in this text, when we prioritize rapport over winning, when we ask calibrated Socratic questions, when we actively shift from debate to collaborative inquiry, we disrupt that architecture. We change the incentive structure of the moment.
We create a localized environment where the possibility of belief revision actually reappears. It's like changing the rules of the game in real time so that everyone feels safe enough to put their weapons down. Now, understanding the system and using these tools doesn't guarantee agreement. You might use every technique perfectly, you might build a beautiful golden bridge, ask a brilliant calibrated question, and still walk away fundamentally disagreeing.
But that is not a failure. The goal of an impossible conversation is not forced consensus. The goal is to make meaningful dialogue structurally possible again. It is about altering how beliefs are examined, slowing down the immediate escalation into hostility, and moving toward a gradual, shared reflection on how we know what we claim to know. It is about restoring the fundamental human connection that allows society to function.
And that empowers you. You, listening to this right now have this systemic perspective to spot when a conversation is functioning as a toxic contest. You can see the invisible architecture that is making people defensive. And you have the exact tools: golden bridges, calibrated questions, confidence scales, the Socratic shift, the unread library effect, to dismantle that contest and intentionally shift it into a collaborative inquiry. You have the ability to stop pouring gasoline on the fire and start building bridges instead.
As we wrap up this deep dive, consider your own most fiercely guarded belief, the one that defines you, the one you defend the loudest. Are you holding on to it because the objective evidence is genuinely, universally undeniable? Or are you holding on to it simply because letting it go would mean losing your place in your favorite social group?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.